The Industrial Revolution Part 2. Of course, we had seen how the Industrial Revolution had changed the way Americans worked and lived. How before the Industrial Revolution, Americans were master craftsmen working at home, making a few items for local sale. And after the Industrial Revolution, Americans were going off to work, someone else setting their schedule, but mass producing items to sell around the world, which lowered the cost of the items. Then we've seen how the Industrial Revolution had also spurred the transportation revolution, and how that had created new inventions like the steam engine, which helped invent the steamboat and the railroad, and how now more Americans were traveling further and faster with more stuff at a lower cost than ever before. But the Industrial Revolution did not stop. It continued, and more inventions brought more and more products to America, and more changed Americans' way of life. So, thanks to the transportation revolution, the number of markets, that is, the number of places to sell things, went up, and the amount of trade went up, while prices for things went down. So as railroads headed west and steamboats steamed up and down the rivers, they brought with them people. And those people can now exist in the West because they were now connected to people back in the East through the use of steamboats and through the use of railroads. So those people that moved to the West could now order and bring in building materials, and they could bring in food, and they could bring in supplies they needed, not only to build the West, but also to stay in the West. And of course, with those people starting more towns, then you had more people to sell to. And the more you sell, the price of the product goes down. The transportation revolution also spread free enterprise, our type of economic system. In a free enterprise system, enterprise means business. People are free to make what they want to make, and they're free to sell what they want to sell, and people are free to buy what they want to buy at the price they want to buy it for, with little government interference. And so the steamboat and the railroad, as they move people west, as they move people across the continent, that form of economic system goes with the people. Of course, today we basically call the free enterprise system the capitalist system, or capitalism. So looking at the free enterprise system, of course, people needed food to eat. So if you could provide food for people to eat, they would pay you. Of course, one of the ways to feed people was to grow crops. Now, in order to grow crops, you basically need some seeds, and you need to put them in the ground so the seeds grow. Of course, originally that was basically done by a stick. That you took the stick and poked a hole in the ground and put a seed in there, and then went a few paces and poked another hole and put some seeds in there, and so forth and so on. In some areas, you could basically take the stick across the ground and sort of make a small little indentation in the ground and dump your seeds in every so often, and then cover them back up with the dirt. And in some areas, that would work. In other areas, you needed to plant the seeds a little bit deeper. First of all, if you planted the seeds shallow, oftentimes animals would come by and dig them up and eat your seeds, which means no plants would grow, which means you'd have no food. Also, at a very minimal distance from ground level, those seeds would be susceptible to floods, for example, and to being washed away by a heavy rainfall, or they might be susceptible to very cold weather, etc. So you need to plant the seeds a little bit deeper to secure their growth. And so one of the ways that people had done that was to dig deeper holes, and as metal was invented, they started to use this metal iron to basically sort of dig deeper holes to plant their seeds in. So eventually you have a plow that's made of iron, and basically you take this plow and it sort of digs into the ground much deeper than a stick, and to plant the seeds. Unfortunately, the iron is pretty heavy, so it usually requires at least a team, at least a couple of oxen to pull the iron plow, and which means basically, first of all, you go pretty slow. Also, the iron plow, even though iron uh, digging device dug a little bit deeper than the sticks, so to speak, it still left the seeds sort of susceptible. It still left the seeds sort of open to, again, animals eating it, or extremely cold weather, or extremely wet weather, like floods and things like that. And as a very heavy object, and because your animals were moving very slowly, it took longer to plow your field with the iron plow, for example. And so you're even though you're growing a little bit more food on your land than you used to, something else was needed. So eventually, a gentleman named John Deere comes up with an idea, and his idea is the steel plow. Steel was a very sort of new material at the time, but Deere quickly recognized that because steel could be sharpened, unlike iron, you could make a very sharp blade, and that sharp blade could cut very quickly and easily into the earth at a very deep depth. And also, because the steel was lighter weight than iron, you wouldn't need a very large, heavy oxen to pull it. A horse could do the same thing. So John Deere would invent the steel plow, which would dig much deeper than the iron plow, much more quickly, using a horse, which means you could plant more of your land much more quickly, which means you could actually buy more land and even plant that land, and you could have a greater crop output, which means you would have more crops to sell to more people. And of course, with more crops being sold to more people, you lower the price of food. But once the crop is planted and starts to grow, then you have to harvest the crop, whether it's wheat or corn or whatever it is. And that's where the scythe comes in. Of course, the scythe is often used as far as the Grim Reaper is concerned, and of course the Grim Reaper is cutting down people. But actually the scythe is a farm tool, and it was designed to cut down the wheat and the corn at a much more rapid rate than, say, for example, just a big long knife or a big machete or something like that. And so farmers have been using this scythe to basically cut down food crops that were raised and grew like corn and wheat for a very long period of time. And it worked well in the fact that one man could sort of take that scythe and just sort of make a circle around him, and everything in that circle would quickly be cut down, then move on and basically another 6 feet or so, and then cut down everything in this basically a several foot radius and move on. But others quickly recognized with the rise of the machines, with the rise of industrialization, that maybe a machine might be designed that could harvest the crop much more effectively and much more efficiently and much quicker, and harvest more of the crop than a scythe could. And so we have the introduction of McCormick's Reaper, which again, notice it's on wheels, and notice the cutting instrument is not sort of a rounded, it's now a flat cutting instrument, but basically the blades go round and round, almost like a manual grass cutter would do, and as the blades go round and round, they would basically chop down the roots of or at the very bottom where the corn grew and where the very bottom of the wheat grow, and that would basically knock down the wheat and knock down the corn, so someone could come and basically then take it and bundle it, and then eventually, of course, take that to market. Of course, eventually, they also make a machine that not just cuts down the wheat and cuts down the corn, but another machine that comes in afterwards and basically bundles it up as well, and just leaves big bundles so that somebody come by in a wagon, just sort of pick up a lot of bundles on the field. So eventually they actually put the two machines together to form what's known as a combine. So the seal plow was invented by John Deere, and the mechanical reaper, which is a harvesting machine, was invented by Cyrus McCormick. Not only were both very useful for farmers, but again, you're going to increase the amount of crops you can grow, and you're going to increase the amount of crops you can harvest, which means you're going to be able to feed more people. And by growing more crops, you're also going to be lowering the price that the people pay for their food. So all of these are really good things, especially if you have an increasing population like the United States did. It also meant that you needed fewer farmers to do the work. So instead of maybe a couple of farmers take care of the oxen, another farmer to basically follow it with an iron plow, now basically you could have one person basically following the horse, and basically the horse would be trained sort of move in rows, and one person could take do the same thing as maybe 4 or 5 other people had just done. And that's especially true when you're harvesting your crop. Instead of having all these harvesters in your field with a scythe cutting down everything within 3 feet of them, now you have this machine just going along very rapidly, cutting everything down, and of course then bundling it up, which now means you need a lot fewer farm workers. So you can see that, again, in 1800, probably about 90% of Americans are farmers. And today, only about 1.5% of Americans are farmers. So the industrialization of the farm was really good as far as feeding more people at lower prices, but it, of course, reduced the number of farmers you needed, which in some ways is good for the farmer because you reduce your labor cost, but it also means you need more farmers, which means the people that were farmers now need other jobs. So thanks to the farming revolution, the amount of food went up, while the number of farmers, the amount of time to harvest the crop, and crop prices went down in the farming revolution. I see I misspelled farming there. That's not very good. Farming, but farming the revolution. So that's generally, again, a really good thing, except for if you were one of the farmers that now don't have a job, you're going to have to go find another job. Of course, they're not just developments in, for example, clothing and gun manufacturing and farming as far as machines are concerned, but also the communication revolution, which was sort of an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution, also be very helpful to Americans as well. So, of course, before the communications revolution, basically you had 2 ways of contacting people. One, you can go see them personally and talk face to face, or 2, you could send a letter. So unfortunately, neither one was really good at long distances. So if you wanted to go to talk to someone and you're, for example, in Texas and they're in California, it's going to take you a while to get there to talk to them. Of course, you could send a letter, and the letter would go, as we'll see, by Pony Express or by some type of wagon or rider, but still it's going to take a long time, days and days, to actually get to California, so someone can read your letter, and then it's going to take days and days and days to actually respond to your letter. So an instantaneous way, a way to communicate instantaneously would be really, really good. So that's where Samuel Morse comes in. And basically, his idea is to send a signal, electronic signal, down a wire. Of course, he have looked at Ben Franklin's experiment where even though the lightning did not travel down the wire, electricity obviously went down the wire to move that little key in Ben Franklin's demonstration of electricity a long time ago in the 1700s. And so people quickly realized that the wires could carry an electrical charge. And Morse thought, well, if I can maybe send an electrical charge, and then on the other end of the wire receive the electrical charge, I can send some sort of message across that wire. And so he invents a machine, first of all, that sends the message. And basically, it's a device that has a positive and negative. And basically, when you touch the key down, it completes the circuit between the positive and negative and sends out a signal. And the longer you hold down the key, the longer the electrical signal is sent down the wire. So if you hold it a short while, a very short signal goes down the wire. If you keep holding on the key, a very long signal goes down the wire. So you can alternate those short and long holds on the key and a short and long electrical impulse on the wire to basically create an alphabet. You can da 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 3 short signals, 3 long signals, 3 short signals. 3 short signals would be an S, 3 long signals would be an O, another 3 would be an S. Those were very recognizable things, and one of the reasons they became sort of the code for, we're in trouble, save us, save our ship, SOS. Now, at the other end of this device, the wire would come into a receiver that would take your electrical impulses and make a sound from it, a buzzing sound. Zzz. If you tap the wire one end shortly, and at the other end it goes zzz. And if you tap the wire, the key at one end and held it down for a long time, and at the other end it goes zzz. And again, by alternating short and long keys, you can create an alphabet called Morse code. And people, once they know and have a standardized form that they know that 3 quick dots or 3 quick zzz means S, you can start making messages and sending those messages over long distances, over hundreds and then thousands of miles. So the telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse, was part of the communications revolution, which helped Americans communicate further and faster and at a lower price than ever before. So now, if you're in Texas and had a message to send someone in California, you quickly went down to the telegraph office, you wrote out your message, you handed the telegraph operator, they transformed that into Morse code, they sent that down the wire in California, they would receive the message, and they would then translate the message from Morse code into regular English, and then they would basically send that message or give that paper message and send that to the person that you wanted to send it to. So again, it was quite a development as far as communications was concerned, because now you can communicate instantaneously. Now the news from one part of the country can quickly reach the other part of the country. Now if you need a reply, your reply can come back almost as quickly as you sent it. Of course, the Industrial Revolution was continuing during this time period. The Industrial Revolution had spun off the Transportation Revolution. It has spun off the Farming Revolution. It has spun off the Communications Revolution. But still, mills and factories in New England, they of course were still making textiles. They were still making the cloth to make the clothes, again, because those fast-flowing rivers to supply. Now, they needed workers in New England to man these first factories. However, most of the men were employed. Of course, in New England, that meant cutting down trees and making ships and making sails for the ships and having sailors for the ship. So most people in New England, most men, were actually employed in the shipping industry and commerce and business already. And so when the factories first opened there, the textile mills needed workers. It was hard to find. So one of the first factories that opened was the Lowell Mill, and he thought it'd be a great idea to employ women in the textile mills. Now, of course, at first it was somewhat a hard sell. I mean, you can sort of imagine, especially if you think you have overprotective parents, the knock at the door, and the father answers the door and says, "Yes, may I help you?" And Mr. Lowell says, "Yes, I've come for your daughter." And of course, the father said, "Yeah, just a minute. Let me get a little helper here. My 12 gauge here." And of course, the farmer probably starts blasting away. Of course, Mr. Lowell quickly explains, no, he's not there to take the daughter away for some type of nefarious or bad purpose. He's there to give them a job, to bring them to the mill and give them a job. But of course, still the father's going to be saying, yeah, no, this is my daughter. No, my daughter has always been with me. She's always been on the farm. We don't want to send her away. I mean, but then of course the Mr. Lowell is going to tell you how wonderful the mill is, that they've built special boarding areas specifically for the workers. And the border and the areas are basically, they have sort of a guard on the premises so that no unauthorized people, like unauthorized males to see your daughter, can come to the boarding house. And they also have a doctor on site. And of course, Mr. Lowell says, well, do you have a doctor on site at your house? And of course, the farmer says, no, we have to go way into town to get the doctor, and sometimes they're not there. And Mr. Lowell says, well, you won't have to worry about that if you send your daughter to our mill, because we have a doctor right on site that will not only take care of their wounds or whatever, or anything they might have happen to them, but will also make sure they're eating right and taking care of themselves. And speaking of that, can you make sure here at the farm that your daughter's getting 3 good meals a day every day for the entire year? And of course the farmer says, well, not always, because sometimes the crops don't come in, and sometimes the crops don't grow like we want them to, and sometimes there's a drought and the crops don't grow, and sometimes there's a blizzard and it kills the crops, and sometimes you don't have very much to eat. And Mr. Lowell says, well, at our factory, we're going to make sure that all of our employees are fed 3 times a day, and they're going to get a good diet, and they won't have to worry about not having enough food to eat. And then Mr. Lowell might say, well, also at our boarding house, we have this basically this fireplace that's always kept going and whatever, and which means they're going to be nice and warm during the winter months. And by the way, we also offer educational opportunities for your daughter. I know it's a long way to send your daughter to school here because you're out on the farm and out in the rural areas, and it's so far away. And so I know sometimes your daughter doesn't go to school. Is that right? Oh, yes. The farmer says, sometimes we can't get them to school because we're so far. And Mr. Lowell says, well, we have teachers on site. So not only will your daughter be working every day, but they'll also be in school when they're not working and getting great education. Plus, Mr. Lowell says, we're going to pay them a good wage, which means they can send part of that money back to support the farm. And of course, by this time, the farmer is much more likely to say, yes, my daughter will be happy to go with you. And by the way, the daughter will be happy to go with them because this is a great deal for the young women especially, because what happens if they stay on the farm? Well, they're going to grow up and, well, marry a farmer. They probably won't get a great education. They're probably not going to have any money of their own. That is, their family's going to take care of them until they marry off somewhere, and then their husband's going to take care of them. But now this is a chance for the women to get an education and money of their own. And maybe instead of coming back to the farm after a few years, maybe the women could take that money and maybe do something else besides come back and be a farmer. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a farmer, nothing wrong with marrying a farmer, but maybe some women might actually want to go see the world and travel or do something else with their money. So really, the young ladies were very anxious for the job, and that was the Lowell system. It was going to use young farm girls to work in its mill. He paid them a little bit lower wage than men, but offered many benefits to the girls. Again, the girls lived in clean dormitories, boarding houses. There were chaperones. They were paid cash. They benefited for religious services. They benefited from school services. And so, for example, probably the women would be paid about $4 a week, and male laborers generally paid about $6 a week. Of course, there's going to be a little bit of money taken from the women's paycheck to pay for the boarding and for their food. But of course, if you're the male laborer working in the city or something, you're going to be, taking money out of your paycheck to pay for lodging and pay for food as well. So at a time when there are very few jobs that paid women anywhere near a salary that's like men, this was a really good salary for women. And again, they're at the boarding house, so the amount they get every week, they can save for themselves, and they can even send some back home to support their family. So basically, everyone's going to benefit, and Mr. Lowell is going to get some good workers. Now, there were other systems, called the Rhode Island system, in which basically they invited the entire family to come work at your mill. And eventually that sort of turned into not just the family working at your mill, but including even the younger kids working at your mill as well. but the Lowell system in Massachusetts was one of the sort of the premier or the most important, especially for women in America. And now with the invention of steam engines, you didn't have to worry about locating your factory along rivers anymore, fast-flowing rivers. Now you can move them to cities, urban areas, ports. So instead of being many miles outside of Boston, now you can move your factory to Boston. And first of all, that's good for the business owner because that means their transportation cost is lower. So instead of having that cotton arrive by ship from the port and then taking the cotton, putting it in wagons and then shipping it many, many miles inland, now you basically build your factory almost right by the port, which means you don't have to have all those wagons. You don't have to hire all those people to bring you cotton. And that cuts down your transportation costs, which means you can sell your product for even less, which means more people are going to buy it. But it also means, of course, if you're buying clothes or whatever, cloth, the cost is going to be even less to you. So it's sort of good for the person that's buying it, and it's good for the business owner to relocate to these urban areas. Also, in the urban areas, you're going to have more competition for workers because there's going to be more people in the area. And in fact, because you're locating your factory in the cities, more people are going to be moving to the cities to work in your factories. And that means the city's population is going to be going up. That is, less people are going to be working in the rural areas, the country areas, and more people are going to be working in the cities. So here you can see, basically in the 1800s, about 90% of all Americans, 95%, are in the rural areas. They're in the countries. But as you see, by the year 2000, as you can see the drop here, by 1900, basically you have about only 60% of the people in the country now, and about 40% in the cities. So by the year 2000, basically you have about almost 80% of Americans living in the cities and urban areas, and only 20% in rural areas. Factories during this time also started using mass production techniques after the interchangeable parts invented by Eli Whitney. So mass production would also include the assembly line, where you have these stations and one person basically does one job. For example, you're making guns, one person screws on the barrel to the wooden stock, and then the gun goes down. The next person who screws on the trigger guard, or the trigger, excuse me, and the next person puts bands around the guns, and the next person puts a trigger guard on, and the next person does a little something else to the gun, and then of course the last person takes the finished gun and puts it on a stack waiting for shipment. So that's the assembly line, where one person is basically just doing one job over and over again, and that increases efficiency. That means that you can make more products more quickly, and with more products being made more quickly, that lowers the cost to the consumer. It also, however, means you don't really need a well-educated workforce. It doesn't require a genius to basically take the barrel of the gun and basically maybe screw it in and put two screws in and pass to the next person. So what that's going to do is it's going to give people without much of an education the opportunity to get jobs that they might not have had. So eventually, in the Industrial Revolution process, as things continue, you come across something called the Bessemer process. And the Bessemer process is really important for the making of steel. And the Bessemer process basically uses really high heat, and you basically melt the iron ore that you have, and then you basically blow sort of cold air through the iron ore as it's sort of a liquefied mass of plasma, and that basically knocks the impurities out of it and creates steel, which is much harder than iron. And again, steel you can sharpen, and steel is much lighter weight than iron. And so the Bessemer process is going to be a way to create a lot of steel that before it had been a very long, complicated process to create steel, which means it had been very rare and very expensive, which means people couldn't use it very much because people couldn't afford it. But now with the Bessemer process, you're going to be able to create a lot of steel really quickly, which lowers the price of steel and allows people to build a lot of stuff with steel, including railroads and other things like that. So the Bessemer process, again, as you see, it's basically taking this molten iron ore, and you're basically blowing this air through it to create, to get the impurities out of it, and it's coming out as almost like plasma. It's coming out at a very high temperature, and it's almost like liquid heat. And eventually, when it cools, again, it becomes steel. And of course, you can pour this in different forms to make, short steel bars, long steel bars, etc. So the Bessemer process produced steel faster and cheaper, which helped railroads spread throughout the country. And of course, that helps the transportation revolution, and of course that lowers the price for people to go long distances, but also with railroads carrying stuff, that lowers the price to consumers. And also, of course, with crops being grown through these machines, now you can put your crops on railroads and quickly send them to other parts of the country. So that means that you're going to ensure not only our crop prices are low, which means food prices are low, but that people are going to have food no matter where they live. And then, of course, the Bessemer steel process also includes, the building of new buildings like skyscrapers. So just very quickly here, here's New York City in 1865. This is, I guess, President Lincoln's funeral. And notice that most buildings you can count is 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 stories tall. The biggest buildings here are 5 stories because they're built of bricks and mortar and sort of concrete stuff. And after about 5 stories, after you're building with bricks, it's starting to start collapsing on itself. But then comes the Bessemer steel, which means now you can have steel to build with. And by 1900s, early 1900s, this is what the New York skyline looks like. And you can still see some of those 4 or 5 story buildings down at the bottom, but now you have a lot of taller buildings. So by 1929, you have really tall buildings of 100 stories or more. And that's just one part of the Industrial Revolution. So of course, now that you have more people moving to the cities to get these jobs because the factories are moving to the cities because you have the steam engine, now these people need places to live, and now thanks to steel you can build these tall skyscrapers so people will have places to live and to work in the cities. So the Industrial Revolution is continuing. It does not stop in the 1800s. It continues on after the Civil War, as we'll see, and it continues on into the 1900s as well, as does the farming revolution, as does the communication revolution. All these revolutions really, in many ways, they have their drawbacks, as we'll see. Again, almost nothing in life is all positive or all negative. So all of these revolutions, the communication revolution, the transportation revolution, the industrial revolution, all of them have their drawbacks, but they also have some very good benefits. More and more Americans are able to buy more and more stuff at a lower cost, whether that stuff is stuff that you have in your house, or whether that stuff is a transportation system, or whether that stuff is food. And of course, also, of course, that means more and more Americans are eating more and more food, which means they're growing healthier, which means they're growing taller. I mean, there's a whole host of things. You could go on and on for probably and make this course an entire year just about the Industrial Revolution. But we'll stop right here.